The story in Passion's Shadow takes place in the town Jalandhar. Look at the spelling. Normally in Marathi we say Jalandhar, but the spelling is somewhat different. Jalandhar is a city from Punjab. Now the whole story it takes place in the city of Jalandhar. The narrator is living in this town, Jalandhar. He is working in the secretariat office, as we have seen, and the two other characters, Pushpa and her father, they have come from village to Jalandhar. As the story begins, it is not clear that in what connection Pushpa and her father they have come from village to Jalandhar. In Jalandhar, Pushpa and her father they are staying at the house of Dr. Gurubaksh Singh Madan. Pushpa's father tells narrator at one point that Dr. Gurubaksh Singh Madan is a person from their village and is a very good friend of him. The narrator observes that Pushpa's father is a very arrogant kind of person, particularly with Pushpa. Pushpa's father scolds Pushpa very often. However, the narrator observes that Pushpa consoles herself every time, saying that a father's curses do not affect a daughter. A father's curses do not affect a daughter. That means, though Pushpa's father curses her, abuses her, every time Pushpa thinks that those abuses, those curses will not affect her life, will not affect her future. At the beginning of the story, we see that the narrator is under impression that perhaps Pushpa and her father they are to the town Jalandhar to find a match, a husband for Pushpa. The narrator remains under impression that he has fallen in love with Pushpa and perhaps Pushpa's father will think of him as a good match because he is young, he is graduate and he is a salaried person. One evening when the narrator is returning from the office to the home, Pushpa's father meets him. Now actually the narrator tries to avoid Pushpa's father because he dislikes Pushpa's father, particularly because of his arrogant behavior towards Pushpa, who is beautiful and innocent. So, Pushpa's father makes certain inquiry to the narrator, and in a very casual talk, the narrator tells everything about himself. The narrator tells everything because there are two reasons. Number one, he wants to avoid Pushpa's father, and number two, he thinks that perhaps Pushpa's father will think of him as a suitable husband for his daughter. The narrator tells Pushpa's father very insignificant things too about himself. Things such as his love for a vegetable such as cauliflower. How does he love mango? And while telling about himself, he also tells about his cook, who is a Gadwali cook. The narrator's Gadwali cook, he is 40 years old and he has one daughter. The cook's daughter is 20 years old and she is widowed. That means her husband is dead, her husband is no more. The moment the narrator tells the Jat, Pushpa's father, about the widowed daughter, the Jat shows much interest in that girl. And then everything becomes very clear to the narrator. The narrator realizes that the Jat is to the town of Jalandhar in search of a wife for himself. The Jat is there to Jalandhar not to find a match for Pushpa, but he is there to find a wife for himself. And that's why when the narrator tells him about the widowed daughter of the Gadwali cook, Pushpa's father takes much interest in that daughter. In fact, he asks the narrator to ask the Gadwali cook about the marriage of that widowed daughter. And the narrator very plainly tells the chat that there are no hopes from the Gadwali cook because Gadwalis do not marry Punjabis. So the chat is disappointed listening to the narrator. The Jat also tells the narrator that there was one proposal from Guru Baksha Singh. However, that proposal even has been denied by the girl. That's why the Jat loses his hopes. The Jat tells the narrator that he is desperate about wife. He needs a wife. And the Jat claims that he needs a wife not for himself but to look after his property. At this point, the narrator asks him to think of a servant instead of a wife. However, the Jat plainly denies this. He insists that he needs a wife, and thus the narrator realizes that the Jat is a very selfish kind of person. Finally, the disappointed Jat informs the narrator that since there are no hopes in Jalandhar that he will get married, he is returning the village the very next morning. The narrator is surprised. He asks that, what will you do in the village? And the narrator gets shocked when the Jat tells him that in the village he will think about the exchange. At this point, it does not become clear to the narrator what does the Jat mean by the exchange. And then the Jat explains that in the village he will marry Pushpa in someone's house and in her exchange he will bring a woman from that house. Now, such kind of exchange of Pushpa for the sake of the Jat's wife is very shocking for the narrator. The heartfelt narrator thinks that her father's curse is going to fall on her soul. At one point in the story, we have seen that Pushpa, who says that a father's curse do not affect a daughter. Pushpa is very much innocent and that's why she considers that the father's curses will not affect her future, will not affect her life. But looking at the real nature of the Jat, the real nature of Pushpa's father, the narrator thinks that the Jat's curses, they are going to fall on her soon. They are going to change the life of Pushpa very soon. And this change in the life of Pushpa will definitely be soothing to her, acceptable to her. In this way, the story by Mohan Rakesh is a comment on the male dominated society. In our society, there is no place, no role for a woman. This male dominated society is represented in the story by the Jat. He is old, his hair, his beard is grey, and still he needs a woman for the sake of his prestige. He is unable to get a woman, he is unable to get a wife, he is searching for that wife, and when he realizes that he will not get wife, he is ready to make an exchange. In other words, he is ready to sacrifice his own daughter to get wife for himself. So this is our society where there is no voice for a woman. Pushpa is going to pay the price for the sake of her old father. In this way, the writer brings out the very sad and pathetic life story of Pushpa.